Good morning, students. So today we are covering our second lecture of this week, and it deals with market efficiency. So we are looking at chapter 3 of the economics of the public sector by Stiglitz and Rosengart. So a warm good morning again. At least it is morning where I am at. So specifically, what we are going to be looking at is the invisible hand of competitive markets. So the argument here that is essentially presented is that markets work best when there is no intervention from government. So this is essentially free market economics. That's what competitive markets are about. Then we will look at welfare economics and Pareto efficiency, and we will also analyze economic efficiency. So those are the three major topics that we shall be covering in this lecture. So we begin with the concept of the so-called invisible hand that operates in competitive markets. And we need to go right back to 1776, when Adam Smith wrote his Wealth of Nations. And if you don't know who Adam Smith is, you can see his statue in Edinburgh. And Adam Smith argued that it is competition that will lead to individuals pursuing their own private interests. And as a result of that, the public will benefit. And this interest is driven by a so-called invisible hand. So essentially, if you are acting in your own interest, that's the proposition here. If you are acting in your own interest, and within certain bounds, that is why we have laws, what will happen is that public interest will also be served. So that is the idea of the invisible hand. So let's say that essentially there is something that is valued by the public but is not being produced at the moment, right? So what essentially will happen is that someone will have the idea, well, because the public values it, well, what we can do is we can produce this good, or I can produce this good, and he or she will sell that good to the public. By producing that good, one is contributing to the economy, one is also making profits, so that's where self-interest comes into play. And the public now has access to a good that did not exist previously. So the public is benefiting by having access to a good that did not exist. And so is the private individual by being able to make profits by producing that good that the public seeks. So this is essentially the point that we are touching on here. We are seeing this invisible hand of self-interest. And this self-interest relates to profits. Entrepreneurs want to make profits, so they are searching for opportunities. But those opportunities are created by a public demand for a specific good. So for example, why is it that we have cell phones? Well, somebody realized that we want to communicate on the go. So somebody decided to start producing these cell phones. So that individual benefits by being able to sell these cell phones and make a profit. And us, on the other hand, have now the ability to communicate on the go. So this is where you have self-interest acting or existing in order to serve the public interest. What is also a central point of this argument is that government should not intervene and decide which commodity or good is produced or is not produced. So this is the point that we are dealing with, right? So markets function best when they are left alone to regulate themselves. And if we have government intervention, what starts happening is we have a loss of efficiency. So this is what you essentially see in Eastern European economies or former Eastern European economies, where what happened at that historical period of time was that government essentially determined what will be produced. Now that determination did not coincide with what society needed. So resources were allocated to the wrong goods. Okay, so what we had is, so in other words, goods that society did not want were being produced. Now resources were being wasted. What we had is inefficient production. Okay, this is what happens if you try to regulate the market, or at least that is the argument that is proposed. So hence, it is competitive forces, and this is this point here, okay, that lead to a high degree of efficiency. In other words, the market determines or decides what is needed, somebody produces it, acting in self-interest, and that serves the public good or the public interest. So that was the argument in early economics. We call this classical economics, that essentially markets operate best when there is no intervention. However, there are certain events that happened that showed that this is not indeed the case. And that is why there is Keynesian economics, which we'll probably touch on later. where the idea is that government should intervene in order to solve certain market failures. For example, if markets work perfectly, why do we have unemployment? We still have unemployment, right? So, hence, that is why government needs to intervene. So that is a counter criticism or a counter argument to this idea of the invisible hand, that markets should be left to operate by themselves. But this is where we begin with the concept of the invisible hand of competitive markets. So basically, at this point, we are at a point where we argue that markets work best when unregulated. So in reality, as I mentioned, is that most economies are mixed. They are not essentially purely competitive economies, so we don't really deal with purely competitive markets. Okay, so this is the point that I'm addressing. And the reason why is because markets don't work perfectly. So hence, government intervenes to resolve market failure, something that shouldn't really happen if we have perfectly competitive markets, as we assumed on the previous slide. So the idea is that what we want to do is we want to achieve Pareto efficiency, and we can achieve Pareto efficiency by making sure that we allocate resources in such a way that some individuals are better off while no one else is made worse off. Okay, so if we are able to do that, we achieve a Pareto improvement, a change that makes some individuals better off without making anyone else worse off. And this is what we need to do. Why we talk about Pareto efficiency and also Pareto improvement is because what we are aiming to do is we are aiming to resolve market failures, but we want to resolve those market failures by making a group better off or individuals better off without making anyone else worse off. So a market failure arises that we are not utilizing because we are not utilizing our resources efficiently. We could provide more goods and services to certain groups and certain individuals without making anyone else worse off. So now we turn to the discussion to wealth economics, and what wealth economics is concerned with as to what should be produced, how it should be produced, for whom, and who should make these decisions. So we are essentially talking about a normative statement. So we start with a situation that is positive, and then we move to a situation that is normative. So we go from what is to what should be. And what are the fundamental theorems of wealth economics? Well, first of all, every competitive economy is Pareto efficient. Okay, so the idea is here that we can only achieve Pareto efficiency if we can achieve a competitive economy. However, because we have market failures, achieving this might not be that easy. Okay, so that is something we need to worry about. And then every Pareto efficient resource allocation can be achieved through a competitive market mechanism with appropriate initial redistributions. So what is key in this statement are the words with appropriate initial redistributions. So economy might not be Pareto efficient. Some groups or some individuals could still benefit without making anyone else worse off by reallocating resources. And what needs to happen for us to have an ideally competitive model of the market? Well, first of all, we need to have many small firms and households, so small that none can dictate prices. And then also, all firms and households have perfect competition. So essentially, every household and consumer knows what prices are for a specific good. What that implies is that because there are so many sellers of a good, what we can do is we can go and buy good A, let's say, from another seller or another 100 sellers if we need to, because one seller is trying to make a profit. So hence that will eliminate prices. Well, it won't eliminate prices, but it will make profits. So hence, because we have perfect information, we know what is being sold, what we will do at what price. We will go to other sellers and buy from those if a seller tries to raise their prices. So hence, no seller or no buyer can impact prices. So let's put all of this together. So now what we need to do is we need to put together, or we need a representation of a market. And let us begin with a demand curve, okay, which gives us the quantity, gives the amount quantity of a good that an individual is willing to demand at each price. So what we see here is we see a downward sloping demand curve. So this is our first component of the single market. Each point along the demand curve corresponds to a price level. Okay, so as you see here, P subscript 1 corresponds to a lower price and a higher quantity purchased. Okay, call that Q subscript 1. Then price 2, which corresponds to a lower quantity purchased. Okay, so if prices fall, what happens is that the quantity demanded is higher. So people purchase a greater quantity of a good at a lower price. And that is why the demand curve is downward sloping. Then what we have is we have a supply curve. Now the supply curve is upward sloping. The reason why is that the higher the price of a specific good, the greater the quantity of it supplied. So if we are selling at price 2, okay, what we essentially are seeing is a quantity that is supplied that corresponds to, sorry, I didn't draw this exactly, but corresponds to Q subscript 1. Okay, so at price 2, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. Now at P subscript 1, price subscript 1, what happens is that the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. It is only when the price at which the quantity demanded is equal to the price at which the quantity is supplied, what we have is equilibrium. And that is that point here, point E. And we call this the equilibrium price and also the equilibrium quantity for a specific good. Okay, as I've represented it here. Now, what the market supply curve does, very much like the market demand curve, it is essentially the horizontal summation of all demand curves for individuals. So you have thousands of individuals that form the market. We calculate the demand curve by summing the quantity demanded at each price level, and that is what gives us the market demand curve. In terms of the supply curve, what we do is we sum the quantity supplied at each price that producers are willing to produce a certain amount of a quantity of a specific good. Okay, so that can be summarized as follows with these two statements. This one is in relation to the demand curve. This one is in relation to the supply curve. Okay, so I'm just adding that statement there, circling that. And in deciding how much to demand, individuals equate the marginal benefit they receive from consuming an extra unit with the marginal cost, in other words, the price that they have to pay. So whenever you want to consume an additional good, essentially this is saying is that you are concerned with, well, how much benefit will I derive and what is the price of deriving that extra additional unit of benefit? As long as the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, you will purchase more of a given good. Think about it. I like to use the example as beer. I mean, example of beer. We were all students ultimately. So how many beers will you purchase? Well, as you can imagine, after a while, purchasing the extra unit of beer does come with quite a substantial cost. That is in terms of the way you feel and also in terms of how much you have to pay. So what that means is that you will keep on drinking additional beers right up until the point that the price of drinking additional beer is equal to a marginal benefit you get from drinking that beer. And that is when we arrive at equilibrium. So at the equilibrium condition, what we have is supply equaling demand. In other words, the marginal benefit to consumers is equal to the marginal cost to firms of producing that good. Or vice versa, from the firm's perspective, okay, firms equate the marginal benefit they receive from producing an extra unit, which is just the price, with the marginal cost of producing an extra unit. So again, we arrive at equilibrium when the marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. And that is when we have an intersection of the supply and demand curves. So in order to achieve efficiency, or when do we know we have efficiency? Well, there's three conditions that need to take place in terms of exchange. And why we are talking about exchange? Well, because we've now just developed a model of the market. So first of all, what we have is exchange efficiency. So the first thing that needs to happen is that goods need to go to those that value them most. And this is what the price mechanism essentially achieves. People pay for something that they want. They don't pay for something that they don't want. So if you want something, you value it a lot more and you're willing to pay for it. You value it a lot more than someone that doesn't really want it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be paying for it if you don't want it. So that is the very first condition. Second of all, we have something called production efficiency. What this implies is that the production of one good cannot be increased without decreasing the production of another good. Think about this statement. What this essentially means is that you are utilizing resources in such a way, you are fully utilizing resources in such a way that if you had to produce another good, what you would have to do is you would have to shift resources from yet another good. So for example, if we are producing good A and B, if we are fully utilizing all resources are utilized, what we would be doing is to produce more of good A, we would be shifting resources away from good B. Now, if we weren't utilizing resources efficiently, we could produce both more of good B or A, or either one of those goods without decreasing the production of either of those goods or one of those goods. Okay, that's if we had resources that were not being utilized efficiently. But if resources are being utilized efficiently, in other words, we have production efficiency, what this implies is that we need to shift resources from the production of one good to the production of another good because resources are already fully utilized. And finally, what we have is a product mix efficiency. So we are producing a mix of goods that correspond to those that are desired by individuals. Okay. In other words, we are not producing goods that nobody wants. Okay, we are producing goods that society and the market does indeed want. Now, you could ask yourself, well, how is point 3 relevant? This will never happen. Yes, it has happened. This is what happened in socialist economies. Goods that nobody wanted were being produced as a result of an ideological stance. Goods of a low quality that nobody would then purchase. So hence, resources would have been utilized inefficiently, producing something that individuals do not want. So these are the three conditions that are required to achieve economic efficiency. So now we need to turn to this idea as to how is it the society or how is it that individuals decide to consume, and what are the assumptions that essentially play a role and the factors that play a role in determining consumption, specifically optimal consumption, efficient consumption. Let's call it that. Well, let us begin with two individuals, hypothetical individuals. First, what we have is we have Crusoe, and we have Crusoe's utility, and we also have Friday. Friday also has a utility. In other words, given a specific mix of goods that both individuals, Crusoe and Friday, consume, they are able to achieve specific levels of utility. Utility, in other words, satisfaction. So what this curve does is it traces out the maximum level of utility that may be achieved by two consumers. Okay, so this is our utility possibilities curve. Now, what is important about this? Okay, what is a central characteristic of this curve? Well, essentially it is downward sloping. What this means is that if Crusoe wants to consume more, what has to happen is that Friday has to consume less. So we would be moving up this utility possibility curve, and what would happen is Crusoe's utility would rise. In other words, his satisfaction, because he is now consuming more. But the problem that arises is that Friday has to consume less if Crusoe is to consume more and to have a high utility. So hence, along this frontier, it is not possible for Crusoe to consume more unless Friday consumes less. And that is why the utility possibilities curve is downward sloping. So the higher Crusoe's utility, the lower the maximum level of Friday's utility. So this is this point here, and this is what I demonstrated. That as we move upwards along this curve, what happens is Crusoe's utility rises and Friday's utility falls. But what that means is that Friday needs to consume less and Crusoe needs to consume more. And in theory, what should happen, according to the theorems of wealth economics, we should always be operating along this utility possibilities curve. And we should always be able to achieve any point along this curve. Now what you will see is the problem is that this is not always the case. Again, if we are not utilizing our resources effectively, we might end up for some reason at point A. So if we are at point A, what this means is that both Crusoe and Friday could essentially be happier, but they are not, because we are not achieving efficiency. And we should be able to achieve efficiency if we have competitive markets. So we should always be on this curve. So that's important to remember, but we might not be on that curve if we do not have competitive markets. Okay, soon what we will do, we'll put all of this together. So we have a representation of a market. Now what we need to look at, we have a representation of a utility possibilities frontier, which essentially represents a level of satisfaction that can be achieved in a competitive market by both individuals. And now what we also need to worry about is a so-called budget constraint. In other words, we are able to achieve certain levels of satisfaction, however, as long as that is within our budget. And that is why we need to worry about something called the budget constraint. So we turn back to this concept of exchange efficiency, and what exchange efficiency requires is that there are no scopes for trades or exchanges that would make both parties better off. Okay, remember that. Therefore, both parties can trade, they can make exchanges, and they will do so right up until a point when there is no benefit from them to making any trades, for both parties from making any trades. Only then do we have so-called exchange efficiency. And within this paradigm, what we do is we talk about a so-called marginal rate of substitution. And the marginal rate of substitution is the amount of one commodity the individual is willing to give up in exchange for another unit of another commodity. So for example, you might be willing to give up 2 beers in order to attain 1 extra cocktail. That is the marginal rate of substitution. And the idea is that the marginal rate of substitution is that change in consumption that keeps you on the same indifference curve, that keeps you as satisfied. So let's go back to the budget constraint. So we've developed another 2 concepts, or discussed another 2 concepts. And again, that's exchange efficiency, and specifically within the context of trades, and also the marginal rate of substitution. Now, the reason why we worry about the marginal rate of substitution is because we require it for exchange efficiency, which arises when all individuals have the same marginal rate of substitution. You'll see why that is the case later. But let's now turn back to the budget constraint, because this is quite important, and this is essentially central to maximizing utility. So let's talk about Crusoe. Crusoe is one of the consumers in our hypothetical economy, and he can achieve a certain level of satisfaction. Let's say Crusoe has an income of $100, and the price of oranges is 2 and the price of apples is 1. If he has $100, what that implies is that he can consume 100 apples and he can consume 50 oranges. Of course, he could try to consume more. So for example, he could consume to a point to the right of the budget constraint curve, but he's unable to because he can't afford this mixture of apples and oranges. Okay, so that's not possible. On the other hand, he also can consume less, but that doesn't really make sense if he can consume more. So he can consume to the left of his budget constraint, but that doesn't make sense if he can consume more. The idea is that more is better in this instance. And what the slope of the budget constraint does is, it is based on the relative price of oranges and apples. Okay, so that represents the trade-off between apples and oranges. So let's say we move up the budget constraint curve. What this implies is that for every orange that we give up, what we are able to do is we are able to afford an additional 2 apples. So that is where the trade-off aspect comes in. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take Crusoe. And remember, Crusoe is a member or is part of the market. And that market can be represented by demand and supply. So, and there's a number of goods in that market. So we begin with Crusoe, and Crusoe needs to make a choice. Two of those goods that are sold in the market are, number one, apples, and there are also oranges. The very first thing that we need to do is we need to represent his preferences. So Crusoe has a set of preferences. He will consume a mixture of apples and also oranges. And he will consume such a mixture that will give him a level of satisfaction. And that level of satisfaction can be represented by a so-called indifference curve. And here what you see is you see two indifference curves. So that's the first indifference curve, and that is the second indifference curve. What Crusoe wants to be on always is he wants to be on a higher indifference curve. So I subscript 1, this indifference curve, is better or gives him greater satisfaction than I subscript 0. Now, we go and we look at an individual indifference curve. So instead of looking at two curves and comparing them, stating the one represents a greater level of satisfaction than the other, we ask ourselves, what exactly does a single indifference curve mean? And why is it called an indifference curve? The reason why it's called an indifference curve is because it gives us the combinations. It gives us the combinations at which Crusoe is indifferent between consuming a combination of apples and oranges. In other words, any combination of apples and oranges will make him just as happy. So let's start with point B. At point B, Crusoe is consuming 89 apples. At corresponding to that, he's consuming around 17 oranges or so. At point E, what he is consuming is an intermediate quantity. Let's call it, there is an exact amount there, but let's call that, let's say 40 apples. And the remainder, whatever his budget allows him, he is consuming oranges. At point C, he would be consuming, let's say around 60 oranges and also around, let's say, 18 apples or so. So any of these combinations, any combination that he's consuming will keep him on I subscript 0. So any combination along this indifference curve, this specific indifference curve, maintains his level of satisfaction. However, here is a bit of a problem, and this is where budget constraint comes in. He can't consume any combination that he simply wants to because he is constrained by a budget. So for example, point B, now I'm going to use blue. That consumption bundle and that consumption a mix is simply unattainable. He can't consume 89 apples and 17 or 18, I don't exactly know which number that corresponds to, of oranges. That is simply out of his budget. But what he can do is he will consume at point E. So what Crusoe does is he consumes at point E. Now, ideally, what he would like to do is he would also like to consume on indifference curve, I subscript 0. See, he would like to consume a mix of goods that falls on this indifference curve. However, his budget doesn't allow him to do so. So he could be more satisfied by moving upwards onto the high indifference curve. But he's unable to do that because his budget doesn't allow him to. On the other hand, he could also consume below I subscript 0, okay, at this point where I've just made the second X now. However, that is not maximizing his utility. So what Crusoe does is he consumes at the point on the highest indifference curve that he can attain given his budget constraint. And in this instance, that is point E. So that is the point that is tangent to the budget constraint. So just to recap, what we are looking at is a representation of the market, and that market comprises of consumers and sellers. And Crusoe is one of them. And what we are looking at is how does Crusoe make his decision as to where to consume? And that is determined by indifference curves, which represent his satisfaction, and also the budget constraint, which dictates how much he can consume given the amount of income that he has. So to recap, what Crusoe does is he consumes at a point that is attainable on the highest indifference curve. And remember, any mix of goods along that indifference curve gives him a certain level of satisfaction. So hence, we have a point of tangency where the slope of the indifference curve is identical to the slope of the budget constraint. So hence, the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio of two goods. And because all consumers face the same prices in a competitive economy and each sets his or her marginal rate of substitution equal to a price ratio, they all have the same marginal rate of substitution. So hence, we arrive at the condition that competitive markets have exchange efficiency. The previous two slides, what we looked at were essentially two consumers. First, we had Crusoe and we had Friday, and the idea was that Crusoe could only be happier if Friday gave up some of his consumption, some of it, which would be associated with happiness. Then what we looked at is the individual consumer, which in this instance was represented by Crusoe. And Crusoe could either consume apples or oranges. But what if we have two consumers or more consumers or n consumers in the economy, as we indeed would? So now let's bring the two consumers together. Both Crusoe and Friday's references can be represented using indifference curves. So here we have Crusoe's indifference curve, and then what we have is we have Friday's indifference curves. Okay, so we are essentially representing the preferences of both consumers on the same diagram. And the way this what this is called, the way we are representing it, is a so-called Edgeworth-Bowley box, where the sides of the Edgeworth-Bowley box give the available supplies of oranges and apples. So now what is happening here in this upper right-hand quadrant? Well, essentially, this is where I'm looking. Essentially, what this implies is that Crusoe can still keep on consuming more. Right? He can keep on moving along indifference curves subject to a budget constraint without making Crusoe worse off. So this process continues until we arrive at tangency, at a tangency of the two indifference curves for both Crusoe and that of Friday. So Friday keeps on moving to a higher indifference curve without making Crusoe worse off. And this continues right up until a point where the two curves are tangent to each other. Okay, so we have a condition of tangency of the two indifference curves. And that condition is at point E. So here, Friday is consuming as much as possible in terms of a mix of apples and oranges without making Crusoe any worse off. So hence, what we achieve is Pareto efficiency. And at this point, the marginal rates of substitution of apples for oranges is equal for both consumers. So what we looked at the previous slide is we looked at how can consumers consume to such a point or to such an extent that we have a Pareto efficiency. Now, what about the production side of things? So instead of looking at the consumption side of things, let's talk about the production side of things. Specifically, let's talk about production efficiency. So what happens if an economy is not productively efficient? Well, this is something they already touched on, but the idea is they can produce more of one good without reducing the production of other goods. So let's say that we are at this point. Okay, what does this point imply? Well, this point implies that we could still produce more apples without sacrificing the production of oranges. And if that is the case, then what this means is we are simply not productively efficient. We can produce more apples without sacrificing the production of oranges. So hence the points inside where I've made this new X, I'll choose a different color, are attainable, but they are inefficient. We are not using our resources efficiently to produce the maximum or the attainable amount of goods that we could be producing given the resources that we have. And hence, we can produce more without sacrificing the production of any goods. So then what happens if we are producing on the frontier? Then we are achieving production efficiency. We are employing our resources in such a manner that we are producing as many goods as possible. And if we had to produce, let's say, more apples, if we wanted to shift upwards, what this means is we would have to reallocate resources from oranges and produce fewer oranges. So hence these points along the frontier are feasible and efficient. On the other hand, we could also produce outside of the production possibilities frontier. But the reason why we are not producing there is because we don't have the resource in the economy to do so. So hence we can't produce at that point. So this point here is simply unattainable. This point here is attainable but inefficient, and any point along the production possibilities frontier is attainable and efficient. So please remember that. So now what we need to look at is how is it that we produce. So what we do is we look at isoquant and isocost lines. So first of all, what is an isoquant line? An isoquant line is the combination of inputs such as, let's say, land and labor that yields the same level of output. Again, what we also want to do is we want to produce more of a given good. So essentially what we want to do is we want to be on Q subscript 1, the higher isocost line. A higher isoquant line. On the other hand, this is the line that we can potentially only be on, Q subscript 0. So that is the isoquant that we can be on. So again, more output is better. However, the problem that we have in achieving more output, given a mix of resources, in this instance land and labor, is limited. So hence, each of these resources does have a cost, and we can't purchase or we can't create an infinite amount of these resources. So that is when we are limited by a so-called isocost line. So on which isoquant line do we want to be? The one that is tangent to the isocost line. So yes, we could produce at this point here a given level of goods and services using the resource or using resources. However, we are unable to achieve that point. However, we can produce a similar mix at this point here, given the amount of land and the amount of labor that we have and the prices of these inputs. So the firm maximizes its output given a level of expenditures on inputs at the point where the isoquant is tangent to the isocost line. So hence, this is where the firm produces, although it could ideally produce here, but cannot achieve that isoquant line. So that is how the production decision is made. So at the point of tangency that we saw on the previous slide, the slope of the isoquant is equal to the slope of the isocost line. So hence the marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to a price ratio of the two inputs. And in a competitive economy, all firms face the same prices. So all firms using labor and land will set the marginal rate of technical substitution equal to the same price ratio. All will have the same marginal rate of substitution. So this is the condition that is required for production efficiency. So how do we allocate resources between apples and oranges? And this is again what we can do is what we can use the Edgeworth-Bowley box for. We can answer this question. So we have a limited amount of inputs that can be used into the production of either apples or oranges. So let us begin at point C. What's happening at point C? Well, point C, some resources are still unused. What we want to do is we want to be on a higher indifference curve. And we can therefore, because resources are being unused, and these resources are number one, labor, and also then land, what we can do is we can utilize them more efficiently and increase these resources or increase our inputs into the production of apples. And hence what would happen is we would move to a higher isoquant curve. And so this process would continue right up until we arrive at point E, where we achieve production efficiency. At this point, we cannot produce any more oranges without sacrificing the production of apples, and vice versa. So we can't produce more apples without sacrificing the production of oranges. In other words, if we want to produce more apples, we have to shift resources into apple production away from orange production. But at this point, we do not have to shift, or in this quadrant, we do not have to shift our resources away from the production of oranges into the production of apples if we want to produce more apples. And the reason why is because we are not using all our resources. So only at this point are we utilizing all our resources to produce apples on oranges, and hence what is happening is that we are achieving a productive efficiency. So what we've looked at now is the individual consumer. What is it that maximizes individual consumer utility? What we've also looked at is how do we maximize production, how do we achieve production efficiency given the resources that we have. Now what we need to talk about is what is the best mix of goods and services that we should be producing given preferences and given the resources that we have. So what we look at is product mix efficiency. Okay, so this is what we are looking at. So in order to choose the best mix of apples and oranges to produce, we need to consider both technical feasibility, so what we can produce, and also what individuals want. In other words, individual preferences. So given the production possibility schedule, so what we can produce, we want to achieve the highest level of utility. We want to satisfy as many consumers as possible. And just to simplify the situation, we assume that all individuals have identical taste. Remember, this is an abstraction. The market is such, and the economy in general is such a complex structure or institution, whatever name you want to assign to it. So what we are dealing with is we're dealing with an abstraction of the situation. So at what point do we produce? Well, we bring it all together. So first of all, we have indifference curves, which represents preferences. And then also what we have is the production possibilities frontier. Again, utility is maximized at the point of tangency of the indifference curve to the production possibility schedule, and that is at point E. Why is that the case? Well, remember, we always want to be on the highest indifference curve because that represents the highest level of satisfaction. And then the trade-off between two goods, that will keep a consumer just as happy. So in order to be just as happy, you can take away some apples, but you need someone to be compensated with some oranges. Well, let's start on this curve. Why don't we want to be on this curve specifically, this indifference curve, where this point E is, point apostrophe? Well, the reason why is because we can be on a higher indifference curve. And that is this indifference curve. And that corresponds to a point E on this indifference curve. Why specifically at point E? Because this is the mix of goods that we can produce, the resources that we have. We could also ideally be at this point, but we can't produce this mix of apples and oranges, given the resources that we have. So hence, that is why we need to be at a point that is tangent. The point on the indifference curve that is tangent to the production possibilities curve. And we require, therefore, the marginal rate of transformation to be equal to the consumer's marginal rate of substitution, where the marginal rate of transformation is the slope of the production possibility schedule. So the slope of this curve. And that needs to be tangent to the marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of the indifference curve. So, in summary, what is it that we need to achieve in order to be Pareto efficient? And that ties into the concepts that we developed in the previous slides. We need to achieve three basic conditions. Number one, exchange efficiency. Number two, we need to achieve production efficiency. And also, then what we need to do is we need to achieve product mix efficiency. So, in other words, for point one, no one can be better off without making anyone worse off. For point two, We must not be able to produce any more goods by sacrificing any other alternative good. And then we must produce the product mix that allows us to achieve the highest indifference curve, that allows society to be most satisfied or gives greatest satisfaction to society as measured by indifference curve. So in order for an economy to be competitive, all three conditions must be satisfied.